50,000 volts of electricity ripped through the man in the faded gray hoodie, sending him crashing into the manicured grass. The arresting officer smirked, utterly convinced he had just neutralized a dangerous drifter in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. He slapped the cuffs on tight, dreaming of a commendation. He didn't know the man bleeding in the dirt wasn't a vagrant. He had just brutally assaulted Elias Thorne, the billionaire tech mogul whose cybersecurity company practically owned the city, and Elias was about to burn the officer's entire life to the ground. Morning dew clung to the perfectly sculpted hedges of Belmont Ridge Park, an exclusive enclave nestled in the wealthiest zip code in the state. The neighborhood was a fortress of silent money where tech titans, hedge fund managers, and old money heirs hid behind iron gates and private security patrols. Elias Thorne did not look like he belonged in Belmont Ridge, even though he owned the largest estate on the hill. He was the founder and CEO of OmniDefend, a global cybersecurity and artificial intelligence firm valued at billions. His software protected international banks, power grids, and the very police department that patrolled this neighborhood. Yet Elias despised the performative displays of wealth that his peers indulged in. He didn't drive a bright yellow supercar or wear watches that cost more than a suburban home. On this crisp morning, Elias was dressed in his usual running attire, a faded university hoodie, plain black sweatpants, and a pair of worn-out running shoes. He was pushing through mile 5 of his morning jog, his breathing steady and rhythmic. His mind, however, was light years away from the gravel path beneath his feet. He was mentally restructuring a hostile takeover of a rival data firm, running through algorithms and corporate defense strategies. Reaching the old oak tree at the center of the park, Elias slowed to a halt. He took a seat on an iron bench, pulling his sleek, unmarked prototype smartphone from his pocket to review an encrypted email from his lead counsel. 2 blocks away, Officer Harlan Crow was cruising in his patrol vehicle, sipping lukewarm coffee and nursing a festering sense of entitlement. Crow was a man driven by petty authority. He had been on the force for years, a tenure marked by a trail of excessive force complaints and racial profiling allegations that the police union always miraculously managed to sweep under the rug. Crow viewed himself as the ultimate gatekeeper of Belmont Ridge. He liked patrolling the wealthy neighborhoods not to serve the residents but to bask in their proximity, enforcing an unspoken bigoted boundary of who belonged and who did not. Turning the cruiser onto Parkwood Drive, Crow's eyes locked onto the figure sitting on the bench. Crow slowed the car to a crawl. He saw a black man in a ratty gray hoodie, hood pulled up against the morning chill, intensely focused on a high-end smartphone. In Crow's biased, narrow mind, the narrative wrote itself instantly. This was a transient, a package thief casing the neighborhood, a threat to the pristine serenity of Belmont Ridge. Crow didn't bother radioing dispatch. He didn't think he needed backup for a simple harassment eviction. He just wanted the satisfaction of asserting his dominance. He threw the cruiser into park, the tires crunching aggressively against the gravel shoulder. He unclipped the restraining strap on his holster, adjusted his utility belt, and stepped out into the cool morning air. Elias didn't immediately notice the approaching officer. His eyes were scanning a complex string of legal clauses, his mind entirely absorbed in the mechanics of a multi-million-dollar acquisition. He was a man accustomed to deep, uninterrupted focus. "Hey you, put the phone down," a harsh voice barked. Elias blinked, pulling himself out of his corporate calculations, and looked up. Standing several feet away was a police officer, hand resting menacingly on his duty belt, chin jutted out in a posture of aggressive confrontation. The officer's nameplate read Crow. Elias calmly locked his phone screen and slipped the device into his hoodie pocket. He pulled his hood down, revealing a face completely devoid of intimidation. "Good morning, officer. Can I help you?" "I didn't ask for a greeting," Crow snapped, closing the distance between them. "I asked what you're doing here. This is a private community park, residents only." "I am aware," Elias replied, his voice a low, even baritone. He did not stand up. He did not cower. This immediate lack of deference instantly infuriated Crow, who was used to fear and compliance. "I'm just taking a rest during my run." "Your run?" Crow sneered, his eyes scanning Elias's faded clothes with undisguised contempt. "Right, where did you run from? Because you sure as hell don't live in Belmont Ridge." "Actually, I do," Elias said simply. He pointed up the hill toward the sprawling modern glass and steel compound barely visible through the pines. "I live at the top of Crestview Lane." Crow let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Crestview Lane, the Thorne estate. That house is worth millions, buddy. You expect me to believe you own it?" "I don't expect anything from you, officer," Elias replied, the temperature in his voice dropping to an icy chill. "But I have answered your question. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to finish my rest and head home." Crow's face flushed red. Nobody dismissed him, especially not a man he had already categorized as beneath him. "Stand up," Crow commanded, his voice echoing sharply across the empty park. "Stand up right now. You're going to show me some ID." Elias remained seated. He knew the law perfectly. He was an incredibly powerful man. But at this moment, he was just a citizen exercising his constitutional rights. "I'm not carrying an ID. I'm jogging. I only have my phone." Then unlock the phone and hand it to me, Crow demanded, taking another step forward, violating Elias's personal space. Let's see if it's even yours. Absolutely not, Elias stated firmly. The phone contained classified Department of Defense contracts. Even handing it to a beat cop was a breach of federal security protocols. You have no reasonable suspicion that I have committed a crime. You are profiling me. I suggest you get back in your car and leave. Crow's eyes went wide with pure, unadulterated rage. He saw red. The utter audacity of this man to quote the law to him, to dismiss him, triggered every insecure, tyrannical instinct in his body. Crow lunged forward, heavy leather boots scraping aggressively against the concrete as he crossed the final few feet. Without another word of warning, the officer reached out with a heavy hand, grabbing the shoulder of Elias's hoodie in an attempt to violently yank him off the bench. Instinct and martial arts training kicked in. Elias did not strike the officer, but he immediately executed a defensive pivot, shrugging off Crow's grasp and stepping back to create distance. "Do not touch me," Elias commanded. His voice wasn't a yell, it was a lethal, vibrating warning. It was the voice of a man who commanded boardrooms full of ruthless billionaires, a man who did not tolerate insubordination. Crow, however, was completely blind to the reality of the situation. In his eyes, Elias's defensive movement was resisting arrest. It was an assault on a police officer. It was the exact excuse Crow had been craving. "Resisting! Stop resisting!" Crow screamed, entirely for the benefit of his own dash cam, which was parked too far away to capture the nuance of the interaction, but would certainly record the audio of his shouted commands. Before Elias could articulate another sentence, Crow's hand flew to his belt. He didn't reach for his handcuffs. He bypassed his pepper spray. He unholstered his taser, leveled the bright yellow weapon directly at Elias's chest, and pulled the trigger. Pop! Two barbed probes shot through the morning air, embedding themselves deep into the fabric of Elias's hoodie and the muscle of his chest. 50,000 volts of pure electrical agony instantly seized control of Elias's nervous system. His muscles locked up in a violent, uncontrollable spasm. The world tilted violently, the sky vanished, replaced by the crushing impact of the concrete path as he fell straight backward, unable to brace his fall. His head cracked against the edge of the pavement, slicing open the skin above his eyebrow. Pain, white-hot and absolute, coursed through his veins. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. He could only endure the endless seconds of the electrical cycle. As the current finally stopped, leaving Elias gasping for air and trembling on the ground, Crow pounced. The officer drove his knee viciously into the small of Elias's back, pressing the billionaire's bleeding face into the dirt. "Thought you were smart, huh?" Crow panted, violently yanking Elias's arms behind his back. The metal handcuffs ratcheted tightly around Elias's wrists, biting deep into his skin. "Thought you could talk back to me. You're going away for a long time, pal." Elias tasted blood in his mouth. His head was spinning from the impact, and his chest felt like it was on fire, but his mind was crystal clear. It was a terrifying, absolute clarity. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, he simply turned his head slightly, staring up at the officer with eyes as cold and calculating as a supercomputer. He memorized the badge number pinned to Crow's chest, 7492. "You have no idea what you've just done," Elias whispered, his voice dangerously calm despite the blood running down his face. "Shut up!" Crow hauled Elias to his feet by the handcuffs, sending a fresh wave of agony through Elias's shoulders. Crow shoved him roughly toward the cruiser, slamming his head against the doorframe before throwing him into the plastic back seat. Crow walked around to the driver's seat, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He felt victorious. He picked up the radio mic. "Dispatch Unit 4, I have one suspect in custody resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, suspicion of burglary, en route to the precinct." The drive to the station took only a short time. Elias sat in the back, silently watching the city roll by. He was calculating the exact legal and financial kinetic strike he was about to unleash. He was going to dismantle Crow's career, but he wasn't going to stop there. He was going to audit the entire department. When the cruiser pulled into the precinct sally port, Crow dragged Elias out, parading his captured criminal through the heavy metal doors and into the bustling booking area. "Got a live one here," Crow announced loudly to the room, shoving Elias toward the booking desk. Refused to ID, got aggressive, had to tase him. Sitting behind the elevated booking desk was Desk Sergeant Marcus Ellison, a veteran of the force. Ellison was a man who knew every face in the city. He was exhausted, sipping cold coffee and dreading his upcoming retirement. Ellison looked down at the suspect. He saw the scuffed clothes, the dirt, the blood dripping from the cut above the man's eye, and the taser wire still dangling from his chest. Then Ellison looked at the man's face. The sergeant's blood ran completely cold. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. His coffee cup slipped from his trembling hand, shattering on the linoleum floor and splashing brown liquid everywhere. Ellison knew that face. Just recently, Ellison had attended a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the precinct's brand new state-of-the-art cyber crimes division. The man standing battered in handcuffs in front of him was the man who had personally written the multi-million-dollar donation check to fund it. "Crow!" Ellison breathed out, his voice shaking with a terror that made the other officers in the room instantly freeze. "Crow, what have you done?" Crow puffed out his chest, completely oblivious to the impending apocalypse. "Like I said, Sarge, found him prowling Belmont Ridge. He fought back. Needs to be booked for felony resisting." Ellison stood up, his knees visibly shaking. He didn't look at Crow, he looked directly at the billionaire, his voice cracking with panic. "Mr. Thorne, sir, I am so sorry." Crow frowned, confusion finally piercing his arrogant armor. "Thorne, Sarge, this guy is a vagrant. He was pretending he lived at the Thorne estate." "He doesn't live at the estate, you idiot!" Ellison roared, the sound echoing off the concrete walls like a gunshot. "He owns it. That is Elias Thorne. He practically owns this entire city." Silence slammed into the booking room. It was absolute and suffocating. Crow stared at the bleeding man in front of him, the reality of Ellison's words slowly penetrating his thick skull. The smirk finally vanished from Crow's face, replaced by a sickening, bottomless dread. Elias Thorne slowly straightened his posture, ignoring the handcuffs, projecting the aura of an emperor rather than a prisoner. He looked directly into Crow's terrified eyes and smiled. It was a terrifying, blood-stained smile. "My lawyer's name is Lena Holt," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the silent room. "I suggest you call her because by the time the sun sets today, I am taking your badge, your pension, and everything you think you own." The silence in the precinct booking room was so absolute, so suffocating, that the hum of the fluorescent lights sounded like a roaring engine. Sergeant Marcus Ellison fumbled with the keys to the handcuffs, his hands trembling violently. He couldn't get the small key into the slot. He was sweating profusely, the realization of the catastrophic liability unfolding in his lobby, completely short-circuiting his brain. "Sir, please, just let me get these off you," Ellison stammered, finally managing to unlock the heavy metal restraints. The cuffs fell away, revealing deep, angry purple indents bitten into Elias Thorne's wrists. Elias did not rub his wrists. He did not ask for a towel to wipe the drying blood from his temple, nor did he request medical attention for the twin puncture wounds on his chest, where the taser probes had violently pierced his flesh. He simply lowered his arms, adjusting the cuffs of his ruined university hoodie, and stood completely still in the center of the room. He was a statue of pure, calculating retribution. "I want the dashcam footage from Unit 4 secured and uploaded to a neutral server immediately," Elias stated, his voice devoid of anger, but heavy with an authoritative weight that made every officer in the room instinctively straighten their posture. "I want the GPS logs of Officer Crow's vehicle pulled, and nobody touches my phone." Officer Harlan Crow had backed away until his shoulders hit the concrete wall. The arrogant sneer had been completely wiped from his face, replaced by the hollow, glassy-eyed stare of a man watching his own execution. He looked at his hands, he looked at the taser still holstered at his side. He tried to speak, to offer some pathetic justification, but his throat had completely closed up. He was a bully who had just kicked a sleeping dragon, and the fire was already building in the back of the beast's throat. "Crow," Ellison hissed, pointing a trembling finger toward the back corridor. "Get into the holding office. Do not speak to anyone. Do not touch a computer. Give me your badge and your service weapon right now." Crow numbly unclipped his gun belt, placing it on the desk alongside his silver badge. The metallic clatter echoed like a death knell. He retreated into the hallway, a ghost in his own precinct. Ellison grabbed the secure red telephone behind the desk, a line reserved exclusively for catastrophic emergencies. He dialed the direct number for Police Chief Marcus Harlan. Miles away at the prestigious country club, Chief Harlan was lining up a crucial putt on the 9th hole. He was rubbing elbows with city council members, enjoying a morning of political schmoozing. When his encrypted duty phone vibrated, he sighed, annoyed at the interruption, and answered. "Harlan?" "Chief, it's Sergeant Ellison at the central desk." The voice on the other end was frantic, high-pitched with terror. "You need to get down here right now. Drop the club and get in your car." "Calm down, Ellison. What's going on?" "We have a major incident. Worse. Officer Crow just brought in a suspect from Belmont Ridge Park, tased him, beat him up, booked him for felony resisting." Gallagher frowned. "And that's an internal affairs issue, Ellison. Why are you calling me on the red line?" "Because the suspect is Elias Thorne, Chief," Ellison said, the words dropping like anvils. "Crow tased Elias Thorne, the CEO of OmniDefend. He's standing in my lobby, bleeding on the floor." The color drained from Harlan's face so fast he stumbled backward, his expensive golf putter slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the green. The city council members watched in confusion as their police chief turned the color of ash. Harlan knew precisely who Elias Thorne was. Thorne's company held the multi-million-dollar cybersecurity contracts for the city's entire emergency dispatch grid. Thorne funded police pensions through his charitable foundations. He was untouchable. "I am on my way," Harlan whispered, sprinting toward the clubhouse before the phone even left his ear. Back at the precinct, the heavy glass double doors at the front entrance violently swung open. The blinding morning sunlight flooded the dim lobby, framing a silhouette that made Ellison's stomach drop all over again. It was Lena Holt, the lead corporate litigator and personal counsel for Elias Thorne. Lena was feared across the region. She didn't practice law, she weaponized it. Dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal suit and carrying a sleek leather briefcase, she walked into the precinct with the terrifying grace of an apex predator entering a cage full of wounded rabbits. She was flanked by two massive men in dark suits, OmniDefend private security operatives. The officers at the front desk instinctively stepped back. Lena didn't look at them, her icy blue eyes locked immediately onto Elias. She saw the blood on his face, the dirt on his clothes, and the burn marks on his chest. Her jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the thermonuclear legal war she was about to launch. "Elias," she said softly, stepping up to him, "are you severely injured?" "I will survive, Lena," Elias replied calmly. "The situation is exactly as I texted you." Lena turned slowly, fixing her gaze on Sergeant Ellison. Ellison felt like he was staring into the barrel of a loaded shotgun. "Sergeant," Lena began, her voice a deadly velvet whisper, "my client was unlawfully detained, physically assaulted with a deadly weapon, and deprived of his constitutional rights by one of your officers. You have exactly 3 minutes to release him into my custody, or I will file an injunction that will freeze the operational budget of this entire department by noon." "He's free to go, Miss Holt," Ellison stammered, raising his hands in surrender. "There are no charges. It was a catastrophic misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," a booming voice echoed through the lobby. Chief Harlan burst through the back door, his chest heaving, his golf shirt drenched in sweat. He sprinted to the desk, his eyes darting between Elias and Lena. "Mr. Thorne, my God, I cannot express the depth of my apologies. This is an isolated incident. I assure you Officer Crow will be severely disciplined." Lena Holt slowly turned her lethal gaze toward the police chief. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Disciplined?" Lena echoed, the word dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Chief Harlan, you seem to labor under the delusion that we are here to file a civilian complaint. We are not." She unlatched her briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, slamming it down onto the booking desk with a sharp crack. "This is a preservation of evidence demand. I want Crow's dash cam, his body cam if he bothered to turn it on, his radio logs, and his entire disciplinary history spanning his career," Lena commanded. "Because we are not just suing him, we are going to expose the systemic corruption that allowed a rabid dog to patrol the streets with a badge. You have 72 hours to prepare your legal team, Chief. You are going to need every single one of them." Elias Thorne walked out of the precinct shortly after, refusing the city ambulance that Chief Harlan had desperately tried to arrange. Instead, he slid into the back of an armored black SUV driven by his private security detail. Lena Holt slid in next to him, instantly opening her laptop. "Take us to the private wing at St. Jude's Medical," Lena instructed the driver. She turned to Elias, her fingers already flying across the keyboard. "I've got our PR director, Olivia Sinclair, drafting the press release. We control the narrative before the police department tries to leak some sanitized version of events." "Don't sensationalize it," Elias said quietly, leaning his head back against the leather seat, finally allowing a wince of pain to cross his features. "Stick to the raw facts. The facts are damning enough." By the time Elias's wounds were being cleaned and sutured in a secure VIP hospital suite, the storm had officially broken. OmniDefend's public relations machine executed a flawless targeting information strike. They didn't release a fiery emotional statement. They released a cold clinical timeline of events. A prominent black tech CEO sitting peacefully in his own neighborhood park, brutally assaulted and electrocuted by a police officer without provocation. The story exploded within hours. It was the leading headline on every major national news network. The phrase Belmont Ridge assault was trending globally on social media. In the mayor's office downtown, panic had escalated into full-blown hysteria. Mayor Jonathan Prescott, a politician whose entire re-election campaign relied on the economic boom brought by OmniDefend headquarters, was screaming at his chief of staff. "How does this happen?" Mayor Prescott roared, pacing frantically across his plush carpet. "He's the biggest employer in the city. We just signed a multi-million-dollar infrastructure grant with him last week. Get Chief Harlan on the phone right now. I want that officer fired, stripped of his pension, and thrown in a cell before the evening news." But firing a police officer wasn't that simple, and Harlan Crow was desperately fighting for his professional life. Sitting in an interrogation room at Internal Affairs, Crow had called in his union representative, Frank Donovan. Crow was sweating, but his arrogance was slowly beginning to creep back in. He thought he knew how to play the system. He had survived excessive force complaints before. Look, the guy wasn't carrying ID, Crow lied, leaning across the metal table toward the Internal Affairs investigators. He refused direct orders. When I went to detain him, he lunged. He reached into his pockets. I thought he had a weapon. It was a split-second decision to deploy the taser. I feared for my safety. That's the protocol. Frank Donovan, the union rep, nodded vigorously. My client followed departmental guidelines for a non-compliant suspect exhibiting pre-assault indicators. Thorne's wealth doesn't exempt him from the law. It was a good faith mistake. That was the standard defense, the feared for my life shield that had protected corrupt officers for years. And without body cam footage, which Crow had conveniently forgotten to activate, it would be his word against Elias's. Crow knew the dash cam was parked too far away to see the physical altercation clearly. He thought he had a viable exit strategy. He was completely wrong. At exactly that afternoon, Lena Holt held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. Dozens of microphones bristled before her. She looked into the cameras, her expression unyielding. Officer Harlan Crow has claimed in his preliminary report that my client was aggressive, non-compliant, and reached for a weapon, Lena announced to the flashing cameras. He believes that because his dash cam was obstructed, he can fabricate a narrative to justify his brutality. He is mistaken. She held up a sleek black smartphone, the exact prototype device Elias had been holding in the park. My client is the CEO of the most advanced cybersecurity firm on the planet, Lena continued, her voice echoing across the courtyard. The device he was carrying is a proprietary Omni-Defend secure terminal. It is designed to protect highly classified corporate data. As a security measure, the moment it detects a sudden violent spike in the user's biometric data, such as a massive jolt of electricity or a spike in heart rate, it automatically begins recording encrypted environmental data to the cloud. Inside the Internal Affairs room, Crow and his union rep were watching the press conference on a small television. Crow's face went completely slack. The blood drained from his head, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. The device, Lena said with a lethal smile, recorded crisp, high-definition audio of the entire encounter. It recorded the GPS telemetry, proving my client never moved aggressively. It recorded Officer Crow escalating the situation, making racially biased remarks, and deploying his weapon without warning against a seated, compliant citizen. Lena paused, letting the devastating reality of the evidence sink in. Furthermore, we are not simply suing the city, Lena declared. At that afternoon today, we filed a federal civil rights lawsuit for $10 million. But we are not naming the city as the sole defendant. We are suing Officer Harlan Crow personally. We are piercing his qualified immunity based on gross negligence and malicious intent. We are going after his home, his assets, and his pension. In the Internal Affairs room, the silence was deafening. Frank Donovan, the staunch Union defender who had fought tooth and nail for Crow just seconds prior, slowly stood up from his chair. He looked at Crow, his face a mask of disgust and self-preservation. "Frank," Crow croaked, panic finally shattering his composure. "Frank, what are we doing? We can fight this, right? You guys have lawyers." "I don't represent you anymore, Greg," Donovan said coldly, grabbing his briefcase. "The union protects cops who make mistakes. We don't protect cops who lie on official reports when there is undeniable cloud-secured audio proof of perjury. You're on your own." Crow watched the union rep walk out the door, the heavy metal slamming shut behind him. The arrogant, untouchable gatekeeper of Belmont Ridge Park was finally completely trapped in a cage of his own making, and the billionaire he had assaulted hadn't even begun to tighten the screws. The swiftness of Harlan Crow's downfall was something entirely foreign to him. For years, he had operated within an invisible fortress of institutional protection. Whenever he crossed the line, there was always a sympathetic sergeant to massage the incident report, a union rep to obfuscate the details, and a legal system willing to give the badge the benefit of the doubt. But against the limitless resources and cold, calculated fury of Elias Thorne, that fortress collapsed like a structure of dry sand in a hurricane. Crow sneaked out of the precinct through the subterranean garage, hiding in the back of a sympathetic dispatcher's beaten-up sedan to avoid the swarm of news vans barricading the front entrance. When he finally arrived at his modest suburban home, the sanctuary he expected was already gone. His wife was standing in the center of their living room, her face pale, surrounded by half-packed suitcases. The television was muted, but the chyron scrolling across the bottom of the local news broadcast read in bold red letters, "Billionaire tased. Audio reveals officer lied." Karen, what are you doing? Crow asked, his voice cracking. The bravado he had wielded just hours ago in the park was entirely absent. He looked small, a bully suddenly stripped of his armor. I'm taking the kids to my sister's house, Karen said, not making eye contact. Her voice trembled, a mixture of disgust and profound fear. The phone has been ringing off the hook, Greg. Reporters, neighbors, people are posting our address online. You lied to me. You called me from the station and said you took down a violent suspect. I did what I had to do. It was a chaotic situation, Crow pleaded, stepping forward, desperately trying to salvage the narrative in his own home. The union is going to sort this out. It's just media spin. Karen finally looked up, and the sheer contempt in her eyes made Crow freeze. The union dropped you, Greg. It's all over the news. They played the audio, Greg. I heard your voice. I heard the way you talked to that man. You didn't sound scared for your life. You sounded like a monster. Before Crow could utter another pathetic defense, Karen grabbed her purse, ushered their two bewildered children out the back door, and drove away, leaving Crow standing alone in a painfully quiet house. He was isolated. But the true nightmare was only just beginning. Desperate, Crow spent the next morning frantically calling every high-profile defense attorney in the state. He needed a shark, someone who could mitigate the impending federal civil rights lawsuit. He finally managed to get Robert Pierce, a notoriously aggressive defense lawyer, on the phone. Mr. Pierce, it's Harlan Crow, he said, pacing his empty living room, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone. I need representation. I have savings. I can pull from my pension. Stop right there, Crow. Pierce's voice came through the receiver, entirely devoid of warmth. I'm not taking your case. In fact, nobody in the upper tier of the state bar is going to touch you. Why not? Everyone deserves a defense, Crow yelled, panic edging into rage. Because my firm's corporate security infrastructure is managed by Omni Defend, Pierce replied coldly. Just like every major hospital, bank, and municipal grid in this region, Elias Thorne is the single most powerful private citizen in this state. But even if he wasn't, I listened to the unencrypted audio dump his legal team released. You committed perjury, assaulted a compliant citizen, and falsified a police report. You are a walking, talking nuclear liability. Call a public defender. The line went dead. At that afternoon, the hammer finally fell. District Attorney Marcus Pierce, a man whose political ambitions were heavily funded by tech sector donors, called an emergency press conference. Pierce could read the room. The public outrage was boiling over, and Mayor Prescott had practically ordered him to deliver Crow's head on a silver platter to appease Omni Defend. Crow was sitting on his couch staring blankly at the television when he watched D.A. Pierce step up to the podium. After reviewing the undeniable audio telemetry data recovered from the victim's secure device, D.A. Pierce announced to the flashing cameras, "This office has moved swiftly. The behavior exhibited by Officer Harlan Crow is a stain on the badge and a grotesque violation of public trust. Therefore, an hour ago I signed a warrant for his immediate arrest." Crow's heart stopped. He leaped off the couch, his mind frantically scrambling for an escape plan, a way out, anything. But before he could even take a step toward the back door, the heavy rhythmic pounding of fists hammered against his front door. "Police, open up!" a voice boomed from the porch. Crow stumbled to the window and peeked through the blinds. His front lawn was crawling with state troopers. They weren't his buddies from the local precinct. They were state investigators, completely outside of his circle of influence. With trembling hands, Crow slowly unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. 4 troopers, dressed in tactical gear, swarmed the porch. The lead investigator didn't look at Crow with camaraderie. He looked at him with absolute disdain. "Harlan Crow," the investigator said, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault, filing a false police report, perjury, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." As Crow was roughly spun around and cuffed on his own front porch in full view of his neighbors who were watching from their driveways with cell phones recording, the true gravity of his situation finally crushed him. He was shoved into the back of a patrol car the exact same way he had shoved Elias Thorne just hours earlier. The cycle was complete, but the devastation was only half over. The criminal charges were enough to ensure Harlan Crow would never wear a badge again. But Elias Thorne was not interested in merely firing a corrupt officer. He was a systems engineer. When he found a virus in a network, he didn't just delete the single malicious file. He audited the entire mainframe and burned the corrupted code to the ground. While Crow languished in a county jail cell, denied bail due to the severe flight risk and the intense media circus surrounding his case, Lena Holt unleashed the full terrifying might of the OmniDefend legal division. They didn't just push the multi-million-dollar federal civil suit against Crow and the city, they weaponized the discovery process. Lena filed sweeping subpoenas demanding years of internal affairs records, dispatch logs, and disciplinary files for the entire precinct. Chief Harlan tried to block the request, citing departmental privacy, but a federal judge, appalled by the audio evidence of Crow's unprovoked attack, granted Lena everything she asked for. Over a grueling period, OmniDefend's proprietary AI algorithms analyzed the decades of police records, cross-referencing complaints, patrol routes, and arrest demographics. What they uncovered was a horrifying, systemic pattern of abuse. Crow had multiple prior complaints of excessive force and racial profiling. Every single one had been systematically buried by Sergeant Ellison and union officials. Elias didn't leak this to the press. He had Lena bring the data directly to the Department of Justice. The DOJ immediately announced a sweeping federal probe into the city's police department. Chief Harlan, realizing he was about to go down with a sinking ship, abruptly announced his early retirement. Sergeant Ellison was placed on indefinite administrative leave, pending a federal indictment for conspiracy to obstruct justice. The invisible shield that had protected the precinct's bad actors was completely shattered. But the hardest blow was reserved exclusively for Crow. Later, Crow was brought into a sterile, windowless conference room in the federal courthouse for his civil deposition. He was wearing an Orange County jumpsuit, his face gaunt, his arrogant posture completely broken. He looked across the long mahogany table at Elias Thorne. Elias wore a sharply tailored navy suit. He looked perfectly composed, an untouchable titan. The scar above his eyebrow had healed into a thin silver line, a permanent physical receipt of Crow's brutality. Lena Holt led the deposition. For hours, she dismantled Crow's entire life on the legal record. She played the audio recording of the Taser deployment over and over, forcing Crow to listen to his own unhinged, power-drunk voice. She presented the mountain of past complaints, proving Crow was a serial predator hiding behind a badge. "Officer Crow," Lena said, her voice sharp as broken glass, "are you aware that under the doctrines of gross negligence, the city's indemnification policy does not cover your actions, meaning the city is not paying your judgment?" Crow swallowed hard, looking at his court-appointed attorney, who simply stared down at his notepad. "I don't have that kind of money," Crow whispered. "We are entirely aware of your financial status," Lena replied smoothly, "which is why we have already placed liens against your municipal pension. We have seized the equity in your home. Your bank accounts are frozen. By the time the civil judgment is finalized, you will owe my client the entirety of your financial existence until the day you die." Crow broke. The realization that he had lost his family, his freedom, his career, and every dime he had ever earned finally shattered his psychological defenses. He put his face in his shackled hands and began to openly weep in the middle of the deposition room. It was a pathetic, wretched sound. Elias Thorne watched the broken man cry. He felt no pity. He felt no triumphant joy. It was simply the necessary mathematical conclusion to a volatile equation. Crow had introduced violence and corruption into the system. Elias had merely balanced the ledger. "We're done here," Elias said quietly, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't offer Crow a parting insult. He simply walked out of the room, leaving the disgraced officer to drown in his own ruins. The following week, facing an insurmountable mountain of evidence and the reality of a decades-long prison sentence if he went to trial, Harlan Crow signed a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations and aggravated assault. The sentencing hearing was brief. Judge Marcus Pierce looked down from the bench with absolute disgust. "Harlan Crow, you were granted the profound authority of the state, and you chose to wield it as a weapon of terror against the very citizens you swore to protect," Judge Pierce proclaimed, his voice echoing in the packed courtroom. "Your actions have not only ruined your own life, but they have deeply fractured the public's trust in law enforcement. I sentence you to decades in federal prison without the possibility of early parole." The gavel slammed down. The sound was final, heavy, and absolute. Crow was led out of the courtroom in chains, his head bowed, the flashes of the press cameras capturing his final moments of public life. He wasn't the arrogant enforcer of Belmont Ridge anymore. He was just a convicted felon heading to a federal penitentiary where former police officers were forced to live in protective custody, terrified of the very population they used to brutalize. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne returned to the top of his glass and steel compound. He stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the sprawling city, the park where it all happened, just a tiny patch of green in the distance. He had taken a brutal, terrifying hit, but he had used that pain to tear a rotten system out by the roots. He had lost a few drops of blood, but Harlan Crow had lost his entire world. The heavy steel door of cell block D slammed shut, the metallic clang reverberating through the sterile, claustrophobic corridors of the federal penitentiary. Inside a small concrete box, inmate Harlan Crow sat on a painfully thin mattress. He was wearing an oversized, faded khaki uniform that hung loosely over his shrinking frame. The swagger, the arrogance, and the aggressive posturing that had defined his entire adult life had been systematically stripped away, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. Because of his previous occupation, Crow could not be housed in the general population, the very people he had spent years locking up, often using the same brutal, legally dubious tactics he had deployed against Elias Thorne, were roaming the main yard. To place him among them would have been a death sentence. Instead, he was relegated to protective custody, which was simply a polite term for permanent solitary confinement. He spent 23 hours a day locked in this windowless cube, left alone with nothing but the suffocating weight of his own catastrophic choices. There were no union representatives coming to save him. There were no sympathetic sergeants to alter the narrative. He was completely, irrevocably erased from the world he once terrorized. Every week he was permitted one monitored phone call. He dialed the number for his ex-wife, hoping just to hear the voices of his children. But the automated voice of the telecom provider simply informed him that the number had been disconnected. His wife had moved away, changed her last name, and severed all ties. Crow had burned his entire kingdom to the ground for the sake of a fleeting, pathetic power trip in a public park. While Crow rotted in his self-made purgatory, the outside world was experiencing a massive seismic shift engineered by the man he had assaulted. Elias Thorne did not simply take the multi-million-dollar federal civil rights settlement and add it to his already staggering net worth. To a billionaire, that amount was a rounding error. To Elias, it was seed capital for a revolution. Later, Elias stood behind a podium at the steps of City Hall, flanked by his lead counsel Lena Holt and Mayor Jonathan Prescott, who was now desperately trying to align himself with Thorne's reform agenda. Elias officially announced the creation of the Belmont Initiative. Justice is not a paycheck, Elias's deep, resonant voice echoed across the crowded plaza, carrying over the live broadcast feeds of every major news network. True justice is systemic recalibration. A broken machine cannot be fixed by simply replacing one defective gear. You must rewrite the entire operational code. Elias formally transferred the entire settlement alongside additional millions from his personal foundation into a fully independent civilian oversight commission. But this wasn't a traditional toothless bureaucratic board. The Belmont Initiative was armed with Omni Defense proprietary artificial intelligence network. Every police cruiser in the city was retrofitted with advanced telemetry systems. Body cameras were upgraded to Omni Defend terminals that could not be manually deactivated by the officers wearing them. The AI constantly analyzed radio dispatch logs, GPS coordinates, and use of force reports in real time, instantly flagging patterns of biased policing or aggressive escalation directly to the civilian board, completely bypassing the internal police hierarchy. The days of sergeants sweeping excessive force complaints under the rug were over. The system was now transparent, unalterable, and utterly unforgiving to bad actors. The precinct that had previously enabled Crow's reign of terror was gutted. Following the sweeping Department of Justice probe that Elias had initiated, numerous officers were forced into early retirement or fired outright for their complicity in hiding past abuses. A new progressive police commissioner, directly vetted by a community coalition, was sworn in to rebuild the department from the ground up. The culture of impunity had been surgically extracted. Officers patrolling the wealthy enclaves of the city and the marginalized neighborhoods alike operated under the intense, unblinking eye of absolute accountability. Later, the morning mist once again clung to the manicured hedges of Belmont Ridge Park. The neighborhood remained a fortress of silent money, but the invisible, bigoted boundaries that once governed it had been permanently shattered. Elias Thorne pushed through mile 5 of his morning jog. He was wearing the exact same faded university hoodie and plain black sweatpants. The small silver scar above his eyebrow was the only physical reminder of the violence he had endured. His breathing was steady and rhythmic, his mind completely focused. As he approached the old oak tree at the center of the park, a black and white patrol cruiser slowly rolled down Parkwood Drive. Elias did not tense, he did not alter his pace. The cruiser stopped near the gravel path. 2 young officers, neither of whom had been on the force during Crow's era, stepped out. They were conducting a routine community patrol, a new mandate required by the Belmont Initiative. The rookie officer, a young man named Daniels, looked at the billionaire in the ratty sweatshirt. He recognized him instantly, not as a vagrant, but as the architect of the very system that governed his badge. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," Officer Daniels called out, his voice carrying a tone of deep, genuine respect. "Beautiful day for a run, sir." Elias slowed his pace, coming to a halt near the iron bench. He looked at the officers, analyzing their demeanor. There was no aggression, there was no arrogant posturing, just civil servants doing their job. Good morning, officers, Elias replied smoothly, his cold, calculating gaze softening just a fraction. Keep up the good work out here. The officers tipped their hats and returned to their vehicle, leaving Elias to his solitude. He sat down on the bench, pulling his sleek smartphone from his pocket. The air was crisp, the park was peaceful, and the system was finally working exactly as it was designed to. Elias Thorne had walked through the fire of corruption, and he had used the flames to forge a masterpiece of absolute unrelenting justice. The story of Elias Thorne and Harlan Crow is a chilling reminder that true power isn't about carrying a badge or a weapon. It's about the unstoppable force of intelligence, resources, and absolute accountability. Crow thought he was untouchable, preying on those he deemed beneath him, only to discover that karma has a way of balancing the scales with devastating precision. The system was broken, but it took one unyielding billionaire to finally rewrite the code. If you enjoyed this intense story of real-world karma and systemic justice, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories. Drop a comment below. Would you have handled the situation like Elias or done something differently? See you in the next one.